So neoliberalism should be seen as a set of policies, a set of historical practice that is really designed to address the crisis of the 1970s, and that crisis meaning the economic malaise. Jimmy Carter even had a speech called the malaise, America's in a malaise. To address the malaise and the slowdown of the economy, U.S. and global, in the 1970s, to check the challenges from organized labor and the populace in general that wanted change, wanted a piece of the pie, and the global challengers to U.S. corporate global hegemony, right? Two-direction challenge to U.S. capital, domestic at home and global capitalist competitors. And of course, the Soviet Union, not really a capitalist at the time. So this is the origin. This is the origin. And the idea was the economy, U.S. and global, had to be restructured in order to restore the hegemony of U.S. capital for decades to come, several more decades. That's how you should see neoliberalism, restructuring of the 1970s economy to reestablish U.S. hegemony for decades more to come. That's what neoliberalism is about. Now, in my book, I argued this wasn't the first time the U.S. did this, you see. There was a major capitalist restructuring back in the early 20th century after the financial economic crash of 1907-8. The U.S. restructured the economy. It's only then that we got the Federal Reserve, a restructuring on the monetary side, and we got the income tax, corporate and other forms of income taxation, that's after 1908-9. We get the modern tax system, with the corporate income tax, personal income tax, inheritance taxes, and so forth, which is created back, in that period, the first restructuring period, which is 1908 to 1916-17, as the U.S. prepared to establish itself on a global stage, you see, as an equal to Europe, particularly to the British and the French, right? That's what this restructuring was all about. It was all about building a blue water navy. In other words, how are we going to pay for a blue water navy? And, if we want to, really establish ourselves as a colonial power, which we already were, Philippines and the Caribbean were U.S. colonies. If we wanted if the U.S. wanted to do that, and if they wanted the dollar to be equal to the British pound as a global currency, well, certain changes, restructuring in the wake of the crisis of 1907-8 had to occur. That was the first restructuring, where the U.S. rose to an equal level, a co-hegemon in the global capitalist economy with the UK. And after World War I, that becomes really clear. The U.S. is the global co-hegemon with the UK. And the UK, Britain's future looks long-term bleak. The U.S. will displace it. And that's exactly what happened in the second restructuring after World War II. The key event, of course, is the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944, where the U.S. clearly replaces Britain as the global economic hegemon and the global empire. Britain had to cede to the U.S. all kinds of colonies and resources and so forth because it got so indebted to the U.S. During World War II. After World War II, it tried to borrow from the U.S. It thought it would get $6 billion for free. No. Big concessions. The U.S. squeezed the U.K. and in exchange for the $6 billion, demanded and got access to the Middle East. The British Empire in the Middle East. And other concessions were made as well. And the dollar became the dominant currency. The pound became secondary, you see. That was part of the Bretton Woods Agreement. So the second restructuring occurs between 1944-53. And the U.S. not only becomes a co-hegemon, it becomes the global hegemon as a result of the restructuring. Well, restructuring is usually done on a level of a series of economic policies, fiscal policies, monetary policies, trade, dollar, currency, industrial policies. These are all shifted and given different emphasis. And the emphasis and the shift and the new policies are necessary to establish the hegemony, or reestablish it, of the U.S. So we had a major restructuring, right before World War I, and reflected in these big policy changes. Again, fiscal policy, which is tax and spending policy, monetary policy, which is about interest rates and money supply, industrial policy, which is about how you're going to regulate unions, and what about pensions and jobs and wages, and what about regulations of business, and what I call fourth, external policy, which is about trade, goods flows, money capital flows, currency exchange rates, etc. Always there's a certain mix of fiscal, monetary, industrial, and external trade policies associated with each restructuring. There was a particular mix right before World War I. That mix shifted and changed after World War II. And then we have the crisis once again. It's always a restructuring in response to a crisis, whether it's a war or a depression or expectation of war or whatever, or colonial expansion, etc. This is when restructuring occurs. Think of restructuring as a way of changing the shift and the weights, the relationships between these policies in order to ensure your domestic capitalists dominate. We became co-dominant, with the first restructuring, we became the dominant hegemon, U.S. did, after World War II. And then we have another crisis in the 70s, you see. That particular mix of policies served well from 1944 until the 1970s. Then the global economy had changed naturally, had undergone in those several decades. Capitalism had changed significantly in various ways, in terms of money, in terms of technologies, in terms of markets, and so forth. And of course, those old policies that were created 44 to 53 no longer served the capitalist expansion the way they once did right after World War II. And the policies no longer stabilized and ensured economic growth, and we had the crisis of the 1970s, economically and reflected politically as well. And then, in response to that crisis, we had the third restructuring, which is neoliberalism, you see, what we call neoliberalism, because those policies, academics, intellectuals, mostly conservative, but a lot of left progressives fell into that as well, start justifying the new policies developed by business and their political elites, their friends in Congress, justifying those policies called neoliberalism, sometimes in its early phase called Reaganomics or Thatcherism in the UK, right? By referring to these ideas that logically sound pretty good. Markets are more efficient, right? They don't waste resources. Government is wasteful, all that nonsense, right? To justify these new policies. Oh, markets, let's let the markets do what they want. Well, as I talk about in the book, neoliberalism has virtually nothing to do with liberalism. Classical liberal ideas, Adam Smith and others, right, are quite contrary to the policies and ideas of neoliberalism. Maybe the ideas, but not the policies, not the practice, not the true history. No, it's the antithesis of liberalism. But yet you get these arguments identifying these classic liberal ideas with neoliberalism. Well, these are just justifications of the policies. The policies themselves have very little to do with efficient markets, right? With free markets. No. Not even free trade is about free markets. Okay, so we have Reaganomics, the first phase, right, of neoliberalism. And again, neoliberalism is a set of specific policies and a specific policy mix. Neoliberalism in historical practice, not as idea. And of course, fiscal policy is about war and defense spending. It's about taxation, especially business taxation. It's about social program spending. And it's about the deficits and the debt that's created by this fiscal policy mix. Monetary policy is about the Federal Reserve and its manipulation of the money supply and interest rates, whether directly or via quantitative easing. Industrial policy is about containing and throwing back unions and collective bargaining, and limiting and changing the nature of pensions, and allowing healthcare price escalation, and privatizing healthcare. It's about jobs, sending jobs offshore. It's about creating low-quality contingent jobs, part-time temp gig jobs here, low-wage service jobs. It's about sending the manufacturing higher-paid jobs offshore. It's about deregulating businesses, particularly finance, and privatizations. It's about compressing wages and wage incomes while you're accelerating capital incomes. That's industrial policy. External policy is about goods, exports, imports, right? Free trade treaties. But remember, free trade is about money flows, even more so than goods flows. It's about relocating business offshore so that the profits that they make, they can repatriate back to the U.S. and their headquarters, and send goods that they make more cheaply offshore back to the U.S. and send profits back to the U.S. and invest from the U.S. Into these economies to dominate, the production in these economies. We used to call that imperialism, right? Economic imperialism. So money flows, not just goods flows, and currency policies, currency exchange rate policy to facilitate these money flows. This is what's called external policy, free trade, but not just trade, but the flow of money and currency to facilitate the flow of goods and money to the benefit of American corporations, multinational corporations. Right? These are the four policies that constitute neoliberalism. It's a particular mix of these policies, fiscal, monetary, industrial, and external, that defines the historical practice of neoliberalism. Now, these four policies existed in the first and second restructurings that I mentioned, but in a different balance and mix, you see. The mix and the relative weight of these four policies, in the second restructuring coming out of World War II is different than the neoliberal mix and balance, and that's different from the first restructuring. So neoliberalism is kind of the third restructuring of capitalism to ensure the global hegemony of U.S. capitalism and to throw back the challenges, the domestic challenges to U.S. capitalism, all of which arose in the 1970s. And you know what? It was successful, quite successful. They debilitated and decimated the unions. They silenced the social programs. They started cutting social benefits. They provided massive tax cuts for businesses and investors. And they challenged their foreign rising competitors in Europe and Japan. So neoliberalism was successful. The first phase of which we'll talk about the phases of neoliberalism shortly, right? First phase, the originating, establishing of neoliberal policies under Reagan. George Herbert Walker Bush is more of a consolidation stage because of the contradictions and problems in the economy that began to arise because of neoliberal policies under Reagan. So think of second phase as consolidation and cleanup. The third phase is an expansion under Clinton of neoliberalism to new areas that were problems and not really resolved by neoliberalism under Reagan, most notably free trade, NAFTA, and China, right, under Clinton. But other changes under Clinton, like more of a shift towards contingent jobs, low-paid jobs, occurred under Clinton. A further destruction of unions and monetary policies were just sort of taking root. The low interest rates, low dollar, that continued under Clinton. So think of Clinton as an expansion into new areas of neoliberalism. And then George W. Bush, which in the book I call neoliberalism on steroids. This is really a deepening and a further expansion, particularly financialization and the dominance of financial markets, begun under Clinton, but really developed under George W. Bush, which, of course, went too fast, too far, and gave us the crash of 2008-9. Right? So Bush is on steroids. And then it hits the fan. Neoliberalism hits the fan in 2008-9. And the whole neoliberal policy regime is threatened. It's destabilized. And Obama tries to put it together but fails. Put it back together. So the chapter in my book on Obama is called Neoliberalism on Opioids. Right? From steroids to opioids. A little metaphor here. And the book has chapters, on Reagan, on Daddy Bush, on Clinton, and on, Baby Bush, the shrub, and on Obama, and then a long, long chapter on Trump. Because, as I argue in the book, Trump should be viewed as an attempt after the failure of Obama to fully restore neoliberalism, the neoliberal policy regime. Trump represents the attempt to restore what Obama could not, but in a new, more virulent, aggressive neoliberal policy regime, what I call neoliberalism 2.0. More aggressive in terms of tax cuts, more aggressive in terms of trade wars, more aggressive on a whole number of fronts. But I argue further that while Trump neoliberalism is more aggressive, it will fail. And it is failing on a number of fronts already. And what's going to replace it if it fails? Well, I have a chapter looking at what are the contradictions in neoliberalism as a policy and what are the material forces behind it, the changes in technology, in money, in the global economy, and other developments that have been developing on their own, beneath the surface, while neoliberal policies have been evolving and changing and so forth. But these new forces of technology particularly are undermining it already and are going to prevent Trump from fully restoring the neoliberal policy regime. There's a whole chapter on the new technologies and money, changes in the nature of money and control that are coming. They're already underway. They're coming, and the 2020s will be a new crisis decade, much like the 1970s. And the question is, what will replace the neoliberal policy regime? Will it be an even more aggressive form of neoliberalism? More aggressive meaning attacking global competitors of the U.S. and attacking domestic challengers to the business elite in this country and their political elite friends. Will it be even more aggressive than Trump? Well, more aggressive, what does that mean? Is that neo-fascist economic policies? Well, I raised the prospect, but that's another book altogether, and the conditions have to clarify themselves further to be able to see, totally what's coming. But as I've argued before and written before, new technologies like artificial intelligence, which is going to destroy 30% of all the occupations in the U.S., it's going to drive wages down even more than contingent, gig and so forth. Amazon's what I call the Amazon effect, its business model, the Uber gig effect, that business model, artificial intelligence, which will create more of a two-tier economy like never before in extremes. You can have 10% of the workforce doing very well because they will fit within the AI regime. But the other 90% are going to be in deep doo-doo, even worse off than they are today. And that's coming and coming very fast. By 2025, it will be here very clearly. These changes in labor markets, in product markets, in financial markets. I talk about that in a late chapter. And finally, in the book, I talk about how neoliberalism is incompatible with democracy and how already it's beginning to erode in a number of areas, and I talk about the areas, even the limited democracy, democratic rights and structures and norms that we have in this country. It's neoliberalism that has to clear democracy away as we know it in order to continue to expand. And we should see Trump in that sense as well. The rapid decline of democracy, and I talk about the forms of this in the last chapter, called Neoliberalism Destroys Democracy. I talk about it there, and I give examples of it. This is a big question. And if neoliberalism is to restore itself in a more aggressive form, it will have to clear away even more democratic democracy limitations and obstacles to its expansion. So it's not just a book about economic policy, it's a book about how economic policy impacts political structuring and political restructuring, and in particular democracy. And it ends up with a assessment, that last chapter, on Trump's attack on democracy, the forms that it's taking right now, early stage. Okay. So peeling back here, what are the hallmarks, the characteristic hallmarks of neoliberal economic policy? Well, in the book, I list these. And as you'll see, it's not just efficient markets or austerity. It's much more complex. It's significant expansion of U.S. war defense spending. And you see this throughout all the phases from Reagan to Trump of neoliberal evolution. U.S. war and defense spending always continues to expand. It's the subsidization of investors and business profits by means of business investor tax cuts. Well, this was established, with massive tax cuts to begin the whole neoliberal evolution by Reagan in 1981-82. And of course, we see since 2000, $15 trillion in tax cuts, most of which have gone to businesses and investors and wealthy. So business tax cuts are a characteristic policy of neoliberalism, massive tax cuts. And of course, they're expanding even faster. right? A shifting of tax burdens to payroll taxes and aggressive taxes, part of tax policy. Right? Reductions in social program and social benefits spending. This has been going on since Reagan as well. Restructuring of external trade and currency relationships with U.S. global capitalist competitors, allies, and adversaries alike. We see this in trade war here going on, but it's always been a policy element of neoliberalism. Way back with Reagan, the attack on Japan and Europe and the settlements to the benefit of the U.S. global hegemony with what was called the Plaza Accords and the Louvre Agreements back in the mid-1980s. The expansion of free trade treaties, multilateral or bilateral. Of course, multilateral free trade has been a characteristic since George Herbert Walker Bush, and of course, especially under Clinton. He's the one who really expanded it in that direction. But George W. Bush, Shrubby, he expanded free trade. So did Obama. And what we got under Trump, is the appearance of against free trade, but he's against multilateral free trade. He wants bilateral free trade. Trump is a free trader. So he's within the tradition, you see, in the tradition of neoliberal policies. Okay, continuing the list of what constitutes neoliberal policies, we've got a dollar policy, which is to keep the dollar value low, exchange rate low. Well, why? Why do they want to keep the dollar low? Because if you're expanding U.S. multinational corporations into the world, around the world, they call it globalization, another term that obfuscates what's really economic imperialism. The global expansion of U.S. corporations around the world, they call that offshoring supply chains, you see. Again, that doesn't explain the imperialist element of all that. They want a low dollar because if you expand your businesses, around the world, you're buying and selling your products, in Argentina or wherever, in the currency of that country, the peso, whatever. When you want to sell those pesos for dollars, you want to keep the dollar as low as possible so you can get more of them and send them back to the United States. A low dollar also helps U.S. businesses in exports who don't have operations offshore. So neoliberalism is about keeping a low dollar policy. It's about massive tax cuts for businesses and the rich. It's about social program, i.e. austerity, cuts to social programs. It's about currency relationships and keeping the dollar low. And the whole idea of neoliberalism is to create what's called the twin deficit solution. Right? You want to import more than you export. Well, most of the imports are U.S. companies abroad importing back into the U.S. You see, free trade keeps down the tariffs of U.S. companies re-exporting to the U.S., and then they sell it here for more. They produce it less offshore, they sell it here for more. That's what free trade in goods is really about. It's about U.S. multinational corporations. So the twin deficits, if you have that arrangement, it means you're going to accumulate trade deficits. More money is going to flow offshore, more dollars, as you buy more imports than you buy, then you sell exports from the U.S., you're going to get a trade deficit. Trade deficit means you have a net outflow of dollars. We've been flooding the world with dollars since the 1970s and 80s, in particular, ever since, and it's increasing. Right? Another reason why the Fed just keeps the money supply growing. So you're flooding it offshore, and the dollars are going offshore. But that's just the trade deficit. The idea is to have agreements with these countries in exchange for relocating businesses there, which they like because they get a cut, to recycle those dollars back to the U.S. and buying treasury bonds. Or if they're really good friends, we allow them to buy other companies, you see. But by buying treasury bonds, right, you got a net back inflow of dollars. And you use that $500, $700 billion a year of net inflow buying treasuries to pay for your budget deficit. You can run a budget deficit because you got a trade deficit. The money flows back, you see, it gets recycled, whether it's petrodollars from Saudi Arabia, right, or whether it's Chinese buying, Japanese and Europeans buying record trillion-dollar levels of treasuries, U.S. Treasury securities, right? The money flows back. And because all this money's flowing back in, the U.S. can and does run a budget deficit. A budget deficit that enables the U.S. to spend more on wars to keep the empire going, and to give the tax cuts to businesses and corporations and the wealthy. You see, that creates the budget deficit, but the shortfall is made up by foreign countries and corporations buying treasuries, recycling the trade deficit back. Well, this twin deficit solution is one of the great creations of neoliberalism, you see, on the trade side. But most accounts don't talk about that. They don't understand. Most critics and critiques of neoliberalism, even on the progressive side, don't really understand what external policy element of neoliberalism is about. And they don't really understand the monetary side as well. They understand the fiscal side, in other words, war spending, social program cuts, right? Industrial policy they understand, attacking the unions, pensions, deregulation, privatization. But fiscal policy, industrial policy are only half of what neoliberal policy is about. The other half is monetary policy and external policy. These critiques focus more on ideas to begin with, confusing it with classical liberalism, right? They don't understand the relationships between these four policy areas, and particularly external or monetary policy. And they never explain the material forces and the basis behind neoliberalism, giving its origins and driving its evolution, and now leading to its contradictions, which I talk about in the book, and the crisis of neoliberalism under Obama and Trump that's going on right now.